Imagine being dragged out of your car, insulted, and humiliated by two cops who thought they could treat you however they wanted, all because of your skin color. What they didn't know was who you really were. When the truth came out in court, it shocked everyone, and those officers. They learned a lesson they'll never forget. This is the story of Emma, a black woman who was stopped by two officers for no valid reason, treated with blatant disrespect, and taken to court as if she had done something wrong. It's a story about prejudice, abuse of power, and how appearances can be deceiving. But what happened in that courtroom flipped the script in the most unexpected way. This wasn't just about Emma. It was a moment that left everyone questioning how they judge others and how justice should really work. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this story is being talked about and why it holds a powerful lesson for us all. Emma was just finishing her errands when her day took an unimaginable turn. Driving down a quiet suburban road, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Two police officers signaled her to pull over. Confused but compliant, Emma slowed to a stop, rolled down her window, and waited. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but the sinking feeling in her chest told her this wasn't going to be a routine encounter. As the first officer approached, his tone was cold and dismissive. Without offering an explanation, he demanded her license and registration. Emma handed them over, maintaining her calm despite the officer's intimidating demeanor. The second officer stood behind her car, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, watching her every move. "Step out of the car," the first officer barked. "For what reason, officer?" Emma asked, her voice steady but firm. The officer's response was sharp. "Do it now, or we'll make you." Emma stepped out, unsure of what she had done to warrant such treatment. Immediately, the officers began searching her vehicle without permission, tossing her belongings carelessly as if they were looking for something to pin on her. She asked repeatedly why she was being stopped, but her questions were ignored. "You people always act like you're innocent," one officer sneered, loud enough for Emma to hear. Her heart sank. "You people." She knew exactly what he meant, and it wasn't her driving they were talking about. The insults didn't stop there. As the officers rummaged through her belongings, they began making comments about her appearance, her car, and even her assumed lifestyle. It was clear they weren't looking for evidence, they were looking for an excuse. "Where are you coming from? A drug house?" one officer asked, laughing as if he just told a joke. Emma clenched her fists, but kept her composure. Years of discipline had taught her to stay calm in the face of hostility, but that didn't make the situation any easier. Eventually, the officers claimed they had reason to suspect she was involved in illegal activity, though they failed to provide any evidence or specifics. They placed her in handcuffs and led her to their squad car. "Are you serious?" Emma asked, looking the first officer in the eye. "You can explain yourself in court," he replied smugly. The ride to the station was a blur of emotions. Emma felt anger, frustration, and humiliation all at once. But above all, she felt powerless. Here she was, a law-abiding citizen who had dedicated her life to serving her country, now being treated like a criminal because of two officers' bias. At the station, the humiliation continued. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed as if she were guilty of some heinous crime. Other officers in the precinct gave her curious looks, but no one stepped in to question what was happening. Emma remained silent, holding on to the hope that the truth would eventually come out. Her family and friends were shocked when they received her call. Emma explained what had happened, but even as she recounted the events, the disbelief in her voice was clear. How could this be happening in a society that claimed to value justice and equality? The court date was set, and Emma was released on bail. But the damage had already been done. The story of her arrest spread quickly in her community, and although many people supported her, others jumped to conclusions. Some assumed she must have done something wrong, buying into the narrative the officers had created. As the court date approached, Emma prepared herself for what was to come. She gathered evidence, contacted legal representation, and leaned on her support system. But no amount of preparation could erase the pain and humiliation she had endured. The day of the trial arrived, and Emma walked into the courtroom with her head held high. She was determined to prove her innocence, but she also wanted to expose the truth about what had happened. The two officers sat across the room, their expressions smug and confident, as if they were untouchable. As the trial began, Emma's attorney presented her side of the story. Witnesses testified to her character, pointing out her history of integrity and service. Meanwhile, the officers struggled to justify their actions, offering vague explanations that only highlighted their lack of evidence. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone in attendance could sense that something was off about the officers' account of events. But the moment that changed everything came when Emma took the stand and revealed her background. "I've spent my entire adult life serving this country," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I've faced challenges and made sacrifices to protect the very freedoms that were denied to me that day." Her words hung in the air, leaving everyone in the room speechless. For the first time, the officers' smug expressions faltered. They hadn't expected this. Their target was not only innocent, but also someone who had dedicated her life to a cause far greater than themselves. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Emma's military record was introduced as evidence. Her awards, commendations, and years of service painted a picture of someone who was not only innocent, but also deserving of respect and admiration. This wasn't just about an unjust arrest anymore. It was about exposing the systemic issues that allowed such prejudice to go unchecked. Emma's story was no longer just hers, it was a wake-up call for everyone in that courtroom. By the time her testimony was over, it was clear that the officer's actions had been driven by bias, not evidence. The judge's expression hardened as he listened, and the officers began to squirm in their seats. This was no longer a case of, "he said, she said." This was about accountability, justice, and the undeniable power of truth. The courtroom was tense. The smell of stale paper and the sound of rustling papers filled the air. People whispered, looking between Emma and the two officers who had arrested her, their faces hard, expressions unreadable. Emma stood tall at the witness stand, her military uniform underneath her civilian jacket catching the light. Her hands were steady, but inside, her mind was racing. This was the moment she would finally expose what had happened to her. The first officer stood up to give his testimony. His voice was too calm, too rehearsed. "We stopped her because she was driving erratically," he said, his gaze never meeting Emma's. "She was swerving within her lane. We suspected she was under the influence or involved in illegal activity." Emma's lawyer immediately stood up. "Swerving within her lane? You do realize that's not illegal, right?" The officer stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Well, it wasn't just that. She was agitated, uncooperative." Emma's lawyer smirked, shaking her head. "Agitated? You mean she asked why you were stopping her when she wasn't doing anything wrong? Isn't that what anyone would do?" The courtroom was quiet now, everyone's eyes on the officer. He shifted uncomfortably under the pressure, trying to hold his ground but failing. He knew his story was falling apart, but he wasn't backing down yet. "And the search of her car," Emma's lawyer continued, "that was based on what? Her attitude?" The officer paused. "Yes, we felt it was necessary." "Based on what? A feeling?" The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "A feeling doesn't give anyone the right to search someone's property, officer, especially without cause. You can't just invade someone's privacy because they didn't smile at you." Emma felt her chest tighten. She wanted to scream at them, but she stayed calm, her military training kicking in. She'd been trained to handle high-pressure situations. This was no different. Still, hearing the officers try to justify their actions felt like a slap in the face. They were lying, and they knew it. They were trying to cover their tracks, but the truth was coming out piece by piece. Her lawyer turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask that we submit evidence showing that no one, especially an officer, can stop, detain, or search a person on a whim. There's no record, no reason to suggest that my client did anything wrong. The only thing she did was ask why she was being treated like a criminal when she wasn't." The judge didn't speak at first. He only stared at the officers, looking unimpressed. He then nodded and turned his attention back to the testimony. Emma held her breath, knowing her lawyer was doing everything possible to make this case about the officer's clear violation of her rights. Then it was Emma's turn. As she stepped into the witness box, all eyes were on her. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the room stare on her, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, shoulders back, eyes steady. She was no stranger to pressure, and she wasn't going to let these two officers make her feel small. Her lawyer asked her to recount the events of that day, and Emma's voice was calm as she described the stop. She wasn't angry, she didn't need to be. She simply stated the facts. She was pulled over for no reason, insulted, humiliated, and treated like a criminal without ever being told why. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but her words didn't falter. "I'm a soldier. I've fought for this country. I've served my country with honor, and that day, I was treated as if my service meant nothing." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emma wasn't just another civilian. She wasn't just some random person. She was someone who had sacrificed her time, her safety, and her life to protect the very freedoms these officers had trampled on. The judge, even the officers, all seemed to pause. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Emma to be someone with a record of courage and service. But Emma didn't stop there. She continued, her voice unwavering. "I am not a criminal. I have done nothing wrong. And yet, I was treated like I was less than human. What happened to me that day was wrong, and I want it to be known, not just for me, but for anyone who's been treated unfairly simply because of how they look." She felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just telling her story. She was speaking for all the people who had been through this, the countless others who had been subjected to racism, bias, and unjust treatment. She was tired of people thinking it was just one bad experience. No, it was bigger than that. This was a pattern. It was a reality for so many people, and she wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. Her military record was introduced next to her awards, her achievements, and the hard work she had put into serving her country. Each page of the document showed what she had accomplished, her dedication, her sacrifice. It was a stark contrast to the officer's claims that she had been difficult or suspicious. Emma wasn't just an ordinary person. She was someone who had proven herself time and again. The body cam footage was played. Emma watched herself, calm and collected. But hearing the officer's words again, the insults, the dismissive tone, was enough to make her blood boil. "You people always act like you're above the law," one officer had said on the footage. That was the moment when the whole case turned. The officers tried to deny it, tried to claim it was out of context, but the footage didn't lie. The room was silent. Everyone was staring at the officers, watching their smug confidence fade away. Emma didn't smile. She didn't need to. She wasn't trying to win an argument, she was making sure the truth was heard. By the time the video ended, Emma had turned the tide. The officers' credibility was in ruins, and their authority was undermined. The case wasn't about a simple arrest anymore, it was about accountability, systemic bias, and the undeniable power of truth. The room was almost suffocating in its silence. Emma sat, her hands resting in her lap. every muscle in her body tense with anticipation. The judge had just finished hearing all the evidence, and now the entire courtroom was waiting. Everyone was on edge. Every person there knew this wasn't just about her case anymore. This was bigger. This was a statement. Would justice be served, or would the system fail her like so many others? The judge, a man who had mostly kept to himself throughout the trial, now looked down at the evidence in front of him. Emma couldn't read his face. His expression was unreadable. She hated that. She hated not knowing what he was thinking. It felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. After hearing the testimony, seeing the evidence, and reviewing the facts, it's clear that the actions of the officers involved in this case were not just wrong, they were unjust, unlawful, and a direct violation of Ms. Emma's rights. The room went still. Emma's heart skipped. The officers sitting across from her, who had once walked into the courtroom full of confidence, now looked uneasy. Their faces had lost their earlier arrogance, replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. One officer's jaw twitched, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk in front of him. They were realizing it now. Their story was falling apart. Emma wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her wanted to jump out of her seat and shout with relief. But the other part of her was still cautious, waiting for the final blow. The judge wasn't done yet. This case is not just about a single mistake on the part of law enforcement. This is about what happens when the system is manipulated, when people are treated differently based on their race. This is a failure on multiple levels: failure to protect, failure to respect, and failure to follow the law. The words were like a punch to the gut. The officers had tried to paint Emma as the problem: agitated, uncooperative, a threat. But now, in the eyes of the law, they were the ones who had failed. They had broken the law, and they had treated Emma like she was less than human. The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh. Ms. Emma was subjected to unnecessary harassment. She was racially profiled, treated with disrespect, and subjected to an illegal search and seizure. There is no question that she was wronged. The judge paused, letting the words sink in. Emma felt a rush of emotions flood her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The feeling of vindication washed over her finally. Someone saw her, really saw what had happened. Then, the judge's voice cut through the quiet again. Because of the clear violation of Ms. Emma's civil rights, both officers will face criminal charges. They will also be held accountable for their actions in a court of law. They will not simply walk away from this. Emma's lawyer stood and nodded toward the judge. He didn't need to say anything. This was the win they had fought for. The officers' faces had gone white. Their earlier bravado was gone. They were staring down at their hands, avoiding the eyes of anyone in the room. They had no answers now. Emma didn't care. She wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at the judge. Her chest felt tight, but it wasn't fear. It was a sense of relief she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. She had done it. She had fought for herself, for the truth, for all the people who had been treated like she was. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering that both officers undergo retraining regarding constitutional rights, racial profiling, and the appropriate use of force. This ruling will serve as a reminder that no one, not even those in positions of authority, is above the law. Emma sat back in her chair. It was happening. They had lost. She had won. The officers who had tried to justify their actions with flimsy excuses were now being held accountable. Retraining? It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a clear message. You cannot treat people this way. She could feel the eyes of the room on her. There was a sense of weight in the air, a feeling of justice being served. For once, it felt like the scales were balanced. She wasn't just a victim here. She had become the one who stood up, who spoke out, who fought back. And it had worked. But it wasn't just about this one case. Emma knew this was about more. It was about everyone who had ever been targeted for no reason, everyone who had ever been treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. She wasn't just making a statement for herself. She was making a statement for the countless others who had been ignored. And then, the judge did something Emma hadn't expected. He turned to the courtroom. I want everyone here to remember one thing. This case isn't just a victory for Miss Emma. It's a victory for justice. It's a victory for the rule of law. And it's a victory for every person who has ever been wronged by the system. There was a brief silence, followed by a soft murmur among the people in the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement. Others just sat in stunned silence, taking in what had just happened. But Emma stood tall. She was more than just a person who had been mistreated. She was a symbol now. A symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, but more importantly, a symbol of what could be changed. As the judge wrapped up the case, Emma's lawyer turned to her and gave her a small, knowing smile. It was over. The officers had been exposed, and the system had shown, for once, that it could be held accountable. Emma didn't let the moment get to her. She wasn't done yet. There were still fights to be fought, still change to be made. But today, for once, she could say she had won. And maybe, just maybe, her victory would make a difference. The courtroom settled into silence once more. Emma, her heart racing, finally let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The judge had spoken. The officers who had wronged her would face consequences. This wasn't just a win for her, it was a statement. A statement that no one, no matter their position, could get away with racial profiling and unjust treatment. Emma had stood her ground, fought for her rights, and in the end, the law had worked in her favor. As she walked out of the courtroom, a sense of relief washed over her. But it wasn't just relief. It was a feeling of triumph. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the system. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was proof that change was possible. Emma had won, and with her victory, she had sparked hope for others still fighting. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories or check out the next video. The events described in this script are fictional and have been created for storytelling purposes.